Today I've got a huge update with Stop Killing Games. Now, there's good news and there is bad news. I'll start with the bad news. You're going to have to put up with the likes of, let's see, the IMCO, the jury, the petty, the ECI, MEPs, and a whole bunch of other acronyms because, yeah, it's the EU. There's a lot of acronyms. But the good news is captured in this one quote. Here it is. I'd say mission achieved for this one. So yes, they've actually made progress. Now this is all happening because Stop Destroying Games representatives Ross Scott and Moritz Katzner sat in the European Parliament's broadcast studios for a press conference last week. They were happy men, and to prove that, here's another quote. There was no European Member of Parliament that wasn't responding positively. Even the Commission was pretty positive, I'd say. A hell of a quote. Now, the events that quote's all about took place just a few hours before that quote was spoken. That's because they had stood before Europe's politicians and delivered their arguments for why the EU should take the cause of Stop Destroying Games up. And you know what? Even they seem surprised by just how well this went. So that means today, we have a lot to break down. So this was all about the first public hearing at the EU Parliament in Brussels. This is where Stop Destroying Games could lay out the full details of their citizens' initiative and where parliamentarians could voice their support or ask questions. Now, it was hosted by the Committee on Petitions, PETI, with Stop Destroying Games formally representing the initiative, but the other EU bodies involved in all of this do actually matter as well, because also running things were the Committee on the Internal Market and Consumer Protection, IMCO, which was integral in improving the EU's right to repair laws, which, by the way, are giving us nice things like user-replaceable batteries for our tech. But also there was the Committee on Legal Affairs, GURI. Now, based on the committees that were chairing this whole thing, it's actually fairly clear to us how the EU is thinking about this problem and what kind of expertise it needs to solve it. Basically, they're seeing it as a consumer rights problem, and it's one that will need to be interpreted within current laws, basically ones that already exist. Now, to be clear, they weren't going to be providing solutions at this hearing, but what it was an opportunity for Stop Destroying Games to basically make their case, and to make it to everyone involved. So all of those bodies, the parliamentarians, and well, at the end of the day, they're the people who do end up driving policy. And that means that if the reaction from them is good, well, if you back this initiative, then it's good news. So far, it seems the reactions have been quite good. Now, as gamers, we're having to do things like age verify ourselves, and, we also do stuff like ordering DoorDash. Well, you may know about the DoorDash data breach last year. There's also all the stuff going on with our good friends at Discord. Remember the breach they had last October that just got loads of people's government IDs spread across the place? So driver's licenses, passports. It's not good, and it's why I use Incogni. They're our way to fight back. They're today's sponsor, and basically, whenever data leaks, data brokers exist. They harvest it, they sell it on, and if you ever wondered how a spam caller got your number, it's things like that. Now, Incogni solves this by automating the legal work you'd otherwise have to do, and you can join at incogni.com/Bellular News. You'll get 60% off an annual plan there, and all you do is you enter your info, and that's basically that. You've got a legal right to have your data taken down, but it takes hours, it's not permanent. Incogni handles it, where they scan the brokers, they send the requests, they add you to suppression lists, and it's quite cool. On your dashboard, you can just see the names of all the data brokers that they've, yoked your data from. It's quite funny because a lot of them have got really spooky names. And they've also got a new feature called custom removals, where if you spot your info online, you can just paste them a link and have their team look into it for you. Now here's my dashboard. 259 takedowns sent, 6 in progress, 253 completed, 22 suppression lists, and they're monitoring 23 data brokers to ensure that they're not being sneaky bastards and they're actually compliant. It's great peace of mind, and you get 60% off at incogni.com/Bellular News. Okay, to break this down, there are 3 relevant parties here. There are commission representatives. Those are the people who will initiate any action. Then there's the various MEPs. They represent either their political groupings within Parliament or just their own interests. And then, of course, the third group is the Stop Destroying Games team. That comprises of Ross Scott, the founder of the Stop Killing Games movement, and then SDG's organizer, Moritz Katzner. As for the MEPs, Katzner and Ross are mostly right. Things were actually very positive positive. This is very heartening. Many people simply just made supportive statements. Several, though, did bring up their own gaming experience, and at least one of them did that in the form of dozens of memes and references. So it's at least nice someone's trying to make European Parliament fun. And then others were talking about wanting their kids to be protected from anti-consumer behavior. Others who responded were pushing the conversation somewhat into the microtransaction spend area, other things like the cost of games, and potential risks around younger users. Now, there were at least a few challenges. As an example, the German technocrat Axel Voss did specifically try to raise concerns around the legal implications of any changes made here, and that's especially around preserving creator rights as well as consumer rights. And he was specifically interested on the potential impact on licensed content like music or cars, and that kind of thing didn't get fully addressed in the session. Though, if you have played video games, I mean, yes, with cars, but I guess mostly with music, you know what it can be like whenever licenses expire and all the annoying stuff that can happen there. But here's what massively stood out to me, right? And it was a very compelling point. And that is basically that the right to repair idea wasn't really enough for a video game use case. And that's at least in part because developers limit what users can do to the actual games. Where it gets interesting is the suggestion of what to do, which is that rather than a right to repair sort of principle, that the principle should instead be a right to resurrect. And that means you heard it here first. The EU, backed of course by George Soros, is now going to investigate necromancy. Okay, I'll take the tinfoil hat off, that's definitely not true. What it actually means is that once a company, say, ends service for a game, with of course there being licensing terms and length of service guarantees factored in, companies would just give us a bit of a guide of how we can run them ourselves. Honestly, that sounds really good to me. Another thing that was brought up was a Project Gutenberg-style approach to preserving games, so a little bit more similar to books. And I've got to say, at least from a personal perspective, that kind of stuff is music to my ears. But of course, there is more to talk about. I know this is a bit of a dense video. You're a credit to yourself for sticking with me through this. So let's just continue, right? The prevailing mood was that something is actually wrong with the situation with video games and that it does actually need to be addressed. So that's honestly a fairly huge win. Now, it's likely because Stop Destroying Games arguments tapped into some underlying feelings that already exist across the body on consumer protections. You know, I like to think about replaceable batteries, USB-C in phones, you know, the way that things have been moving. And now that the hearings happened, Stop Destroying Games are essentially left with two questions to answer in public. And those are, what exactly counts as a destroyed game, and what were they exactly asking for? Well, first, they defined how a video game is destroyed in their opinion, and you can see it in this flow chart here, with the key points being no clear information on end of support at purchase and a lack of consumer protections for owned property. Now, Scott explicitly stated that subscription games, which clearly define when service can end, actually would not fit in this criteria. And they're also openly saying they've got no interest in changing the business models or the monetization of the games industry in this initiative. It's not saying that they don't want those things to change as individuals, it's just basically about the scope of this initiative. Now, all those criteria matter because when Stop Destroying Games went to the EU Commission for clarity on legal requirements, and to many members of the European Consumer Centres Network, they basically got no clear answer. There was no clear answer, though some of those Consumer Centre members even told Stop Destroying Games that they expected indefinite support for a product, which is really going far. So far that even Stop Destroying Games' representatives kind of found it unlikely. Now, that's because they did make it clear that they're open to, quote, any solution, and that they have zero interest in ongoing support from publishers after a game is discontinued. They also recognize that not every feature could be operable after support ends. And to back that up, I've got a quote from Katzner that I am going to quote with a little bit of paraphrasing so that it kind of flows nicely. So here's what he said. There was a lot of pushback from the games industry, where bodies like Video Games Europe presented solutions that he claimed masquerade as proposals, but which are simply unrelated to our issue. So what he did is presented a list of, quote, proposals which do not address the problem. And those are clearer labeling of license agreement terms, mandating minimum support times by publishers, more notice before a game is destroyed, and then finally legislating that publishers may voluntarily have end-of-life plans for commercial games sold to the public. In response to those things, he says, these are not solutions, nor are they even compromises. Now, it's a little hard to find the nuance here, as we're kind of shifting from the Stop Destroying Games claim that say subscription games won't be targeted because they clearly do warn players. Like, in a way, it seems like there's a few contradictions here, but Katzner argues that the licensing agreements are accepted because the only alternative is to, just not play the video game whatsoever, and that support times and notices of shutdown are effectively unrelated to their concern, and that only the state of the actual video game after the shutdown matters. So, the games industry is probably going to put forward loads of things that aren't related to that narrow definition of the state of the game after the shutdown, with that being the thing that Stop Destroying Games are the most interested in. Now, he goes on to touch other things like publishers being allowed to end support for a game at any time that they wish. Basically, he frames that as the status quo. I would agree with him, it basically is the status quo, and he suggests it's one that the industry does want to keep. He goes on to specifically respond to just one of many concerns from the Video Games Europe industry body, framing that there will be an impact on intellectual property for future titles from, quote, competition from community-supported versions. Basically the idea that a game could be shut down, but then the community-supported version of that game afterwards could, basically be viable competition to the industry. Now, Katzner translates this as basically a business model to shut down the game to get players to go and play the next game. And that basically it's a consumer hostile argument and a form of planned digital obsolescence, where they're basically asking the EU to deal with any case where it's a, quote, deliberate and avoidable decision to destroy a functional game. And you know what? An overall trend we've seen in the games industry is that people tend to play a lot of old games, right? And the idea that even, say, a new entry in a game series can face competition from its older versions, even when those older versions are basically completely unmonetized on a long tail basis by the game publisher. A really good example of that was in our Total War coverage, where you could see some of the modern Total War games really struggling, but then if you look at SteamDB, you just see Medieval 2 still way up there, really strong. And that effectively was a situation where Creative Assembly were being outcompeted by past Creative Assembly's work. Now, obviously, those are mostly single-player games. I just bring it up because it's a fairly simple example of the point that he's talking about. In short, then, which I know sounds like a bit of a funny thing to say given this is a chunky video, but in short, they want the law to be harmonized across all European countries and to be designed to protect consumer rights in the digital single market. There should be no way for a company to unilaterally end support. Now, to achieve that very lofty goal, what they need is the recommendations of the European Commission. So let's talk about the Commission. For the most part, the Commission were cautious. The representative said they held no specific positions on outcomes right now, but they already understood the requests for change. They said they were exploring whether the issue could be resolved better through enforcement or by adapting existing laws, one of those being the existing Digital Content Directive. Now, they didn't believe that existing laws require sellers to support a product for any set duration, but they do think consumers are entitled to transparent information and should be protected from unfair commercial practices. And after spelling that out, they ended the hearing with some responses to some of the questions from Stop Destroying Games and from the European members of Parliament. And the first one's kind of interesting because it's related to this video, basically a French consumer advocacy group doing some suing against our good friends at Ubisoft. That was asked about potentially getting the Court of Justice of the EU involved, but the Commission was actually not willing to get involved in what they saw as being a national legal affair. Now, as for other responses, they just restated their current understanding of the law, that from a copyright viewpoint, there are no mandatory requirements around licensing, that any company has got contractual freedom to exploit their works and to set the terms of their licenses, and that no current framework provides exceptions for end-of-life support. But they did, and this might be good news to many of you, float the idea of provisions from European directives on preserving cultural works, where the rights holders can grant exceptions to let a third party or a cultural heritage group preserve them. This is a side of things that I would say could feel a little bit less relevant to how Stop Killing Games, and I guess this permutation, Stop Destroying Games, how that might apply to your specific case and your specific game library. But it is relevant to games being treated and being valued as pieces of art that do actually deserve to be preserved for future generations maybe to enjoy, but honestly, even if it's just to study academically. Game preservation is in a really dire state. I mean, we've even covered instances in America where, the ESA is basically fighting against it. That stuff absolutely sucked. So it's good this is being talked about, though as of right now, with so many technical rights holders being involved, they did say that it's difficult for them to suggest a solution there. But it's good to know that it is being weighted ahead of the Commission's next move. We have covered a hell of a lot of ground, very technocratic ground. We got our MEPs, we got our various bodies of the EU. Damn, this stuff can really turn your brain into Swiss cheese, though. To say Swiss cheese wouldn't really be accurate because Switzerland is not a member of the EU. Okay, but with all that covered, the final thing for us to do together today is to bring it all in, to work out what's going to come next. All of this means that all eyes are now going to be on the month of July. And that's because after months of lobbying from Stop Destroying Games and of course the industry towards the Parliament and the European Council, then in July, the Commission will publish their report with proposals for action if they think that any action is needed. Now, that report will also likely include opinions on whether Stop Destroying Games asks will fall under the terms of the upcoming Digital Fairness Act, which would at least be a useful vehicle for faster legislative changes. So important if you really want this to be acted on swiftly. Swiftly and EU does sound a bit anachronistic, but you get the point. And the good news on that front is that Stop Destroying Games have already given feedback on that. Now, it's also possible that by then we may have a resolution from the MEPs. You see, the MEPs are able to signal their support for the initiative, and they do that through a vote in Parliament. Then, after all of that, Europe's politicians will begin implementation if they think it is necessary. Now, the real question in July is whether the Commission treats gaming as consumer rights territory at all. You see, existing law doesn't require publishers to support a game for any duration, and there's no copyright framework for the end-of-life exceptions. Stop Destroying Games' ask is harmonization across the whole single market, with no way for a publisher to unilaterally pull the plug. Now, that ask is the sort of thing we could see implemented if gaming does basically get treated here like a consumer rights issue, and it certainly does seem that they're sympathetic to seeing it that way. So, for your next big update, wait till the month of July. That's when we may get to see how the future of gaming looks, at least in the EU, but if you're an American, actually, don't worry, you're not going to be left out because soon we will be getting to the kind of surprising updates from the USA. So that's it for this video. Do you know what? As a good little palate cleanser, I think you should watch this one next about RAM. You've probably seen the headlines about the RAM prices going down and thinking, oh my god, is the hardware squeeze over? Will we finally be able to buy our PC upgrades? I'm going to say no, and I think it's pretty obviously no. It's something called Javon's paradox, and you can learn about it by watching this video next.